All right, we are officially live on YouTube. To our YouTube audience, we'd like to welcome you to this groundbreaking discussion on tithe. It's called Tithe Talk. And we have with us today Professor Remy Ilona, and we have Rabbi Harry Rozenberg, and we've invited them onto this platform to have an open discussion on the subject matter of tithe. This conversation is by no means intended to determine doctrine for any community or assembly. It is a general discussion to gain perspective on the various understanding on tithing based on different Hebrew communities or Israelite communities. And we may glean some information that may be helpful as we continue to halakha or walk out Torah in our various communities. At this time, we'd like to extend the courtesy to our guests to introduce themselves and give a brief overview of their background, and then we will jump into the discussion. It will be a three-part discussion. We will start initially with the biblical definition of tithe, then we'll look at the historical definition of tithe, and then we'll look at the contemporary or the cultural, modern cultural definition of tithe. We'll start with you, Professor Ilona, if you don't mind, introduce yourself to our audience.
Distinguished members of the audience, I am Remy Ilona. I am Igbo by ethnicity, which means you can also say that I'm a Hebrew. If you say that I'm a lawyer, you are correct, because that's my profession in Nigeria. If you say that I'm a professor, you are also right, because I taught in universities in Nigeria before I arrived in the United States. If you also say that I'm the chief Rabbi of the Igbo people, you are also correct, because my associates in Omenana Defenders, the Igbo group that has led the Igbo Renaissance since the past 20 years, came together and recognized me as the spiritual leader of the people. If you want to know more about me, you can go to my YouTube channel. You can go to my Facebook account and find out about me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ilona. Rabbi Rozenberg.
Thank you for the honor of having me here for this discussion. I was born and raised in New York, and I started studying Torah about the age of 1920 seriously, where I moved to Israel, and I went to what's called the yeshiva system to study Torah, which would be, I guess, a comparable, a dojo for someone who wants to study martial arts or become a monk. A yeshiva is someone who wants to immerse himself in the study of Torah. So I spent many years in yeshiva studying. And now I'm still living in Israel, and I'm following my dreams, which I found out only later on were the dreams of a few generations of my ancestors searching for the missing tribes of Israel, which I guess they weren't missing from their perspective, but from the perspective of me, who's a descendant of the Jewish people, quote unquote. We've been looking for them for thousands of years so we could finish up the redemption process. So for me to be in a conversation with people who are from that heritage all around the world is really special and important, and anything I could do to help in that regards, I'm available.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. So let's set the platform here. The purpose of this discussion, again, is to look at tithe from various perspectives. And the information shared here will be the opinion of our guests and not necessarily those of the Great Awakening. However, we do seek to gain insight from this information and how we can continue to understand Torah as we restore our culture. There are many people in the diaspora of Hebrew descent from West Africa or various different African regions who understand tithe from primarily a Christian perspective, where on every Sunday or every Sabbath, you give a tenth of your earnings, your salary, to the pastor or rabbi, and we just want to examine some of those and measure it against the biblical concept of tithe as we see in Torah. We want to hear from the Navis, the prophets, and we may consult the Ketuvim, the writings. So we'll ask the gentleman, Rabbi, we'll start with you first. When we think about the Tanakh, what is the biblical concept of tithe?
Okay, great. I mean, first of all, I guess we should just start looking at the first place we see it happen in the Tanakh, right? So where is the first place you see someone giving 10% back in the Tanakh? And you see it with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we can go through the specific verses if you'd like. Is that what we should do?
Sure, we can share that with our audience.
Okay, because this is the foundation. Anytime there is a halacha or a law in the Jewish world, for us, we can't possibly have that law without saying where in the Torah is the source of this law, or where is the source of this law. So there's no you can't just make something up without showing the source of it. Okay, great. So let's go to Abraham here. I pulled it up at Genesis 14. And this is a story when Abraham goes to rescue his family member Lot, who got kidnapped by the 5 kings. And Abraham goes and rescues him with 318 men. And they say, first of all, this is the source of seeing Abraham was a ninja or a warrior par excellence. He went with 318 men against 5 kings, against the 4 kings. The 5 kings were the ones that were captured. And he destroys them and he rescues Lot. And over here, we see he rescues King Melchizedek of Salem. And I'll read the verse in English. King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of the God of the Most High. He blessed them, saying, Blessed be Abraham, God of the Most High, creator of the heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your foes into your hands. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. So here we see the verse, Genesis 14:20, where Abraham is giving 1/10 tithe, which we call in Hebrew ma'aser, which comes from the word eser, which is the word 10 in Hebrew. So ma'aser means me'eser, from 10, which means a tenth. So here we see in Genesis 14:20, Abraham giving a tenth to the priest. There's another commentator later on, you don't see in the Torah necessarily with Isaac, but it was taught through the rabbinic Judaism that Isaac also was giving a tenth on his produce. But then you see an interesting thing, because Abraham gave his tenth to who? He gave it to a priest, right? But then you see later on in Genesis 28, Jacob is on his own journeying, and he wants assurance from God. So what does he say? He says, God, you take care of my food, you take care of my shelter, you make sure I'm good, and I'll give 10% back. So let's look at the verse, Genesis 28:22. And this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall be God's abode. And all of that you give me, I will set aside a tithe for you. I will give 10% for you, God. It doesn't say here necessarily who he's going to give it to, but obviously it's implied, this is the site of the future temple. I will break off a tenth. So it's still this customary thing to give to a priest, I guess, because later on we see in the temple of King Solomon, there's instituted a tenth that has to be given from your produce, from your hardworking fruits and vegetables that you bring into the world. A tenth would go to the priests and the Levites of the temple period. So that's just the historical context of it, of the whole experience.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi. Professor Ilona? Can you hear us, Professor Remy?
Oh, we may have lost him.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's hearing us. Can you hear us, Professor Remy?
Oh, sure. I began to hear you now.
Okay, thank you so much. So the same question I asked Rabbi Rozenberg goes to you. Based on the biblical text, what is tithe?
Okay, I'm to respond?
Yes.
Yes, I'm grateful to Rabbi Harry for giving us some background of the tithe tradition. And what the Igbo tradition offers us is how it was actually implemented. Because we see in Deuteronomy 14:22, where God actually explained how the tithe is to be administered, who is entitled to which, and where it is actually taken to. You know, when we look at the Tanakh, if we do not do serious reflection, we would not understand that the Tanakh started as an oral tradition, which was eventually redacted and put down in writing. And we have the great advantage that we have finally discovered that tradition that it was taken away from. That it was taken from. That is the Igbo tradition. The Igbo tradition was what the Israelites were practicing that the scribes eventually wrote down. And what I'm going to demonstrate now will give us a clear idea of what the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh only summarized. In Deuteronomy 14:22, God tells the Israelites, let us use the present tense because we believe that this is still continuous instruction. God tells the Israelites, get a tenth of your earnings, go to the place the Lord your God has chosen. As at that time, there was no temple. But the Lord said, go to the place the Lord your God has chosen. When my own father, Ilona, was the head of the Ilona family, every member of the family brings 10% of their farm produce because the Lord God also specified that this has to be food. He took care that this should be food. Take 10% of it, of what your fields produce, go to the place the Lord your God has chosen. The place that the Lord your God has chosen, the Torah did not at that point specify, but among the Igbos, it is understood to be the place where the family gathers, where the head of the family presides over. My father was the head of this family for a long time, for over 20 years. So members of my family would gather there with that 10%. This 10% will be shared. My father, as the priest of the family, gets 10% of that 10%. The other people specified in the Torah, the poor, the Levites, my family accommodated Levites, they are still with us today. They will get a portion and will get a portion. The widows will get a portion. The rest will be used to prepare a meal that the family eats together. It is this tradition, or it is this tradition. This tradition is one of the traditions which gave the Igbos a society that had no destitute in former times. I pause for now.
Thank you so much, Professor Ilona. So let's move the conversation towards who should receive the tithe. So based on the Torah, again, and the writing of the prophets, it alludes to the priestly class or those who are Levites. And it also alludes to being tied to temple service. So let's dive into that a bit. Rabbi Rozenberg, what are your thoughts on who the tithe should go to based on the scriptures?
Okay. There's two types of commandments. There's a Torah commandment and a Torah mitzvah, a Torah commandment, and a rabbinical one. So certain Torah commandments at the time of the temple are applied. And when the destruction of the temple comes, what do we do with Meiser? Then we enter the rabbinic world. So we'll speak about both those right now.
Okay.
In temple times, the way it worked, whatever you grew, first things first, you got to take off the first fruits for the priests. No Levite, nothing, just to the Kohanim, the priests. The priests were the descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Anyone who's from the family of Aaron was a priest. So the first fruits go to the priests. Then after that, whatever you harvest, that you give 10% to the Levites. The Levites were the ones who worked and served and upkept the temple, and they also didn't own land in Israel. When the land was divided up and everyone got a portion of land, the Levites didn't get a land themselves. And I know we'll get to it. I know Remy's got a lot to say there because I think there's something similar to that in the Igbo culture about land owning and Levites, but we'll discuss that when it's his turn. But the Levites didn't own land in Israel, so they lacked a source of income that everyone else would have. But their job was to upkeep the spirituality of the people. So the 10% was then given to the Levites. And then the Levites, when they got that, they would break off a little piece of that and give it to the priest. So it's like, there's break-offs on break-offs. But now the question is, that's what we were doing. So it wasn't a monetary thing. It was a food thing. And there were systems to swap your stuff for money and then redeem it in the temple, and they'll give the temple the fruits from someone else. There were ways to swap the value. But now that the temple's not here, there's the opinion of the Jewish people is that all the while that the majority of the people of Israel are not in the land of Israel, this is not a requirement on us by Torah law. So the second we went into exile, until the majority of the nation returns, which could happen any day now, who knows, that these are not Torah-backed commandments. Now, you don't have rabbinic commandments to give 10% of your food to the Levites, but we still do separate. When I grow in Israel, I still do separate 10% and I put it aside, and there's a special blessing we say. But the issue is many people will confuse giving 10% of your income to poverty as fulfilling the Torah-backed obligation to give 10%, which it's not. They're two different things. The 10% I give on what I make when I work is different than the 10% I would have had to have given to a priest in the times of the temple, specifically because it is now not a Torah-backed commandment. It is a rabbinic commandment to give this charity.
Thank you, Rabbi. If I may ask if I may ask a follow-up question. Professor Ilona brought up a point that prior to the temple being built, that there was a process in place to give to the Levi priests. In your opinion, prior to the temple, how was the tithe administered to the priests, seeing that there was no temple service in place? Was there a reference to the tabernacle?
It's interesting because we see that I'm going to read. I took down some notes through because I saw this question coming up. That giving the tithe to the Levites was told to the Israelites after the incident of Korach, the rebellion, which was in the desert. So at the time of getting Torah. So this wasn't a time when they had even crops or anything. They were disgusting. So can you imagine they're in the desert for 40 years right now, and they have all the commandments on them, but they're not growing anything. They're getting the manna from the heavens, and everyone's getting it equally. So we're not necessarily giving 10% on those, but you see during this time, they're still spoken about it. So my impression is that it wasn't a Torah-backed commandment until the temple was built, but prior to that, I would assume they were practicing it and learning about it for sure. It was a reality well before the temple was built, because we see when it was taught to them while they didn't even have anything to grow. So the question is, how did you pick your Levite? How did you know which Levite to give it to? That we don't know offhand necessarily, but what we can say is that these laws were practiced and kept alive, but not as a Torah-backed obligation at the time.
Thank you so much.
Difference the difference between a Torah-backed commandment and a rabbinically backed commandment. Okay. From my perspective, they're both equals. I look at them both as equals. But from a punishment perspective of what I would be liable for, as far as God and the heavenly courts, those are two different sets of punishments. Because one's, from the Torah, one is man trying to help build a fence around the Torah to keep you pure.
Yeah, and I'm somewhat familiar with minhag and takanot, based in different communities. I'm sorry?
You're already 10 steps ahead of the game.
Not necessarily. I'm still a student.
Okay. No.
All right. So Professor Ilona, if you don't mind, just continuing that conversation, in terms of Omenana, how does that play out? Is
You
the
see,
tithe exclusively for the Levitical class? Is it tied to temple service?
I would still give a background. The Israelites did not grow crops in the wilderness, but remember, Joshua led the Israelites into the land of Israel, and they began to grow crops. And under the leadership of Samuel, there was no temple. Under the leadership of Saul, there was no temple. David, there was no temple. And these laws were practiced. The Ihu, we call it actually Ihu or Nru in the Igbo tradition, was as specified in the Torah in the Igbo community, is taken to the place the family gathers. Remember, when we talk about the temple in Israelite culture, we assume that the Israelites were not gathering before the temple was built. The Obi, which I believe the synagogues took up from, we are there. We do not expect Israelites living in 100 miles away from the temple to go to the temple to do religious rituals. It's too far. So what happens is the people gathered at places. And in the Igbo situation, it was usually at the house of this oldest man, who by virtue of his position is number. The priest is recognized, but the priest never forgets for a moment that the oldest man is his elder. They work together, the priest, the oldest man, and the Levite. Everybody gathers together in the house of this oldest man. The 10% is brought out and disbursed. The priest gets a portion. The Levites, we call them Mumunri among the Igbo, they get a portion. The oldest man, when my father was the oldest man, he usually gets the foot of the animal. Uku ano. Then the poor, if there are poor people in that community, they get some. And this is basically how we disburse it. And as you could see, it falls in line with what we find in the Torah. When Moses, for a moment, never neglected the position of the elders. But the Torah, we do not always remember that even though Reuben, who was technically the elder of that family, lost his position, but before the Levites were appointed, they played a role. And even after the elders were replaced by the priests, Moses would always say, the elders of Israel. I yield back, as you would say in your Congress.
Thank you so much, Professor Ilona. If you don't mind, I'll ask a follow-up question. So, Professor Ilona, are you saying that based on Omenana or Igbo culture, that the tithe does not necessarily have to go to the Levite, it can also go to the elder of the community?
In the Igbo case, it was brought to the place the family gathered. And the number one man there is the oldest man in that family. But in feeding it, the Levite gets a portion. Everybody gets a portion. And remember, what the Torah recommended is that the tithe, he said, the bringer of the tithe should eat the tithe himself. This is clear in Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 14:24, he said, bring the tithes and eat it there in the presence of the Lord your God. But he said, while eating, remember the Levites, the widows and the orphans among you. So what I'm saying is that it's a family feast, more or less. Everybody gets a portion of it among the Igbo. But the Levites, like the Levites that reside in my family, we are not essential, and in some ways, they are not members of my family. But my family accommodated them. My family accommodated them 300 years ago. So they became members of my family by virtue of that. And we don't neglect them. when we share this tithe. They come and share the animals and the goats, the yams, the cocoa yams, the cassava with us. So what I'm trying to say is, we are looking at a tradition that gives us a clear picture of what we find in the what we find in the Torah. We are seeing how it is practiced. Because I want to highlight this point again. These things manifest so clearly in the Igbo culture because the Igbos had a very large area of land for a very long time, and we are able to practice things exactly the way it was done before the scribes wrote it down, and the way the scribes wrote it down. We were able to take that culture of Israel, both as the oral tradition and as the written tradition, and put it into practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And we call tithes Ihu. We call tithes Ihu or Nhru.
Ihu or Ru. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Nhru. It's a difficult word to pronounce. Nhru. Nhru.
Okay. I will have to work on that, Professor Ilona. All right, Rabbi Rozenberg, any comments on the practices as we look at Torah?
Once we're getting more granular, there actually was two types of tithes that you were giving. One was called Meiser Rishon, the first tithe, and the other one was called Meiser Sheni, the second tithe. So the first one is what we gave to the Levites. The second one was what we set aside 10% that we brought for the family themselves to eat at the Temple of Jerusalem. So in regard to Remy saying that there was a tithe that went to the people to eat, the family, the elder to go first, I think that's definitely very biblical sounding to me.
Thank you so much. And just looking at the text itself, and I think we've had this discussion on numerous platforms that the Torah is a summary. However, we have to look at oral tradition. So we're looking at some oral traditions based on Ominana, and then Rabbi Rozenberg will look at some oral traditions based on the Mishnah, or as he may say, rabbinic sources. So from rabbinic sources, Rabbi, if you could share with us how is tithe carried out in the diaspora or while outside of the land?
So Meiser Rishon and Meiser Sheni, the tithes to the Levites, when in exile, are not kept. But we do still practice the giving of 10% or 20% to poor people, to charity. Although that's not a Torah commandment, that it's not as equal as something like the commandment of Shabbat, which God commands us directly in the Torah. We don't see in the Torah God commands us directly to give 10 to 20% to the poor. But in spirit of this tithe, of this meiser, the rabbi said we should upkeep it in the exile and still be accustomed to giving 10 to 20% to the poor. So today, I would say if someone is not sinning, if he doesn't do his 10 to 20%, but if he wants to show a relationship with the Most High, with God, and show a trusting relationship, say, God, look what Jacob did. Jacob wasn't commanded to necessarily, but Jacob said, God, if you provide for me, I'll give 10% back. So that's really the mindset we have to have now, to have an intimate personal relationship with God. But we shouldn't see ourselves as a sinner if we're not doing it, since we're not actually violating a Torah commandment, because we're not in the land. And even if we were in the land, the majority of the people of Israel have not returned to the land yet. And that's a big make or break, to have the majority of the people return to the land. There was even debate in the Second Commonwealth when Ezra came back, is this a rabbinic or a Torah-backed mitzvah, a commandment? But today I would say that the institution of giving money is recommended, but not obligated.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rozenberg. Professor Ilona, any follow-up before we move to our next question?
Not really questions, but a comment. I find Rabbi Harris' explanation very, very interesting, and I think it helps to us to, my comments vis-a-vis will help us to understand some things vis-a-vis the Igbos and vis-a-vis the other communities of Israel. if we would say that the land of Israel is the land of the Israelite people, but the experiences of the Igbos in exile did not stop them from practicing, because, I repeat again, they went into a land that had very little challenges compared to what other branches of Israel went to, the areas the other branches of Israel went into, Europe, Arab world, where they had to adapt in order to survive. But in the Igbo case, we went into a land with very little challenges until the British came. Nobody dared to invade Igbo land. So we practiced exactly the traditions as was practiced by Samuel in Igbo land. And they are still being practiced today because the Levites are still with us. Nobody mistakes who is the Levite among the Igbo. He is well known. He is the person you call when, as somebody commits suicide in Ozobo today by hanging himself, you call that Wanri. The one that dwell in my family, they are from Oreri. You call them, they will purify the land, and before the person's body will be thrown away. So what I'm trying to say is, we didn't have cause to stop practicing what you find in the Torah. Even though I believe we also went into exile, but due to the circumstances I narrated, we didn't lose the traditions, because we didn't have to lose them, because we had nobody telling us not to do it or to do it. We only had to continue doing the traditions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the next question, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thing before we move on?
Yes.
So I just want to be clear, because it's just interesting, it's coming to light now. We're not biblically commanded today to give 10% of our produce to the Levite necessarily, but there still is the concept of giving 10% of produce, or let's call separating it. And then we say there's an argument in Rabbinic Judaism to give that to a Levite or not, but we say we're not 100% certain that the Levites we have today may or may not be Levites, because it's just so far away. We're not 100% sure. Although, you know, Remy is 100% sure with his guys, and I believe him 1,000% that they're 100% sure, because they have their own tradition that dates back. But with us, we don't have that 100% certainty. Even though we trace back, we don't have the 100% certainty. So we do a symbolic exchange for a coin, you know. So if I go to a supermarket in Israel, there will have to be signs on the wall whether or not they already took their tithe from the vegetables and fruits I'm going to buy or not. Now, what they do with that, they could swap. Yeah, and when you go and they say, you know, people call you out also. When you go to someone's house for a meal and you're about to eat a salad, you're like, wait, did you take tithe, or when you bought it from the store, did they do it for you already? So they just make sure, but it's much more of a symbolic act that could be redeemed with a coin after, but it's an act that has to be done.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that. So the next question that I have, just to ensure that our audience are fully aware of what we're discussing here. When we talk about tithe, the conversation has been mainly centered around produce. Is tithe limited to produce or livestock or oil? And I ask this intentionally because for some people, tithe is represented by money. For example, you cannot give someone some produce here in the Americas and they accept that as tithe. They're looking for money. So can we talk about what was instituted as tithe? Was it ever money?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we look at the verse, right, we can pull up the verse now. It does say grain, wine, and oil, like you said. So we have grain, wine, and oil. We believe that even like you're asking about money, we even say with vegetables, different fruits and vegetables, that would also be necessarily rabbinic. So the only one that would be a Torah commandment would be from the grain, wine, and oil. And your fruits and vegetables itself would be considered rabbinic. So like fruits and vegetables are one level removed from that, and now money is like 2 levels removed from that.
Okay, Remy?
We, among us, who was invariably always bought in food items.
Okay.
We didn't see people doing that with money. And we are insisting even now that we are reviving omenana, that it has to be in food, expressly food, because we are very mindful of what happened with the sons of Eli. Even though it was still food that the people brought in offerings, probably were tithes also brought, there were abuses. And we are thinking that if you can solve the problem of hunger, you can deal with other issues. You remember, if we get to the book of Malachi, we would find the prophet warning, bring your tithes into the storehouse so that there will be food in the house of the Lord. If the people are sure that they will always have what to eat, it will be easier for us to deal with social vices. So I believe we got it right there by insisting. Nobody actually told anybody, but it was part of the tradition that you simply bring your basket of yams and grains to the place the Lord your God has chosen. So we didn't have to deal with money as far as Ihu or Nhru are concerned.
Okay. Thank you so much. Then the next question has to do with frequency. I'm sorry, Rabbi Rozenberg.
I just wanted to add one more thing because I pulled up the verse just to read. There's a few sources, but in Nehemiah 13:12, it says, "And Judah brought the tithes of grain, wine, and oil into the treasuries." So it specifically is listing what specific items Judah was bringing. It didn't say, and Judah brought all their harvest, 10% of all their harvest. It didn't say, and all the 10% that they brought. It just says, no, specifically, these are the 3 things that they brought. But that's just, that was just for the source. We can keep going.
Thank you very much. Well, I do have a follow-up question on that, Rabbi Rozenberg. So if someone did not grow the items that could produce the grain, the oil, and the other item you mentioned, how would they support the Levites?
Well, I think there's 2 different ways. There were places where you could redeem like money for things to give to the priests, like to still bring those items. And there was also a rabbinic commandment to tithe from everything. So they were still bringing and contributing, but it's like the commandment of tzitzit a little bit, right? We are not commanded to wear tzitzit, to wear fringes. We're commanded to put fringes on 4-cornered garments. So what happens if I'm not wearing a 4-cornered garment? Am I not obligated in the law? And that's kind of from a Torah law. Yeah, you're right. If you're not wearing a 4-cornered garment, it doesn't require to have tzitzit, to have tassels. So that's like, it's kind of similar to the meiser. Let's say I'm not a farmer, if I don't have a field, so there's nothing to give the meiser from, the 10% from. But still, in those cases, you would see people go to places where there were big farms and redeem with money and to still bring those items down.
Thank you so much. Any follow-up on that, Professor Ilona?
Yes. I would start by saying that I find this discussion very enriching. And even though it's not yet time to thank you for putting it together, I'll thank you for putting it together, because what is the primary purpose of discussions like this? It is for us to understand things we should know very well, to understand them more. You see, when we look at the contemporary world we live in, we assume that is the best. But meanwhile, we've left paradise behind. God prepared Israel to be a model nation. Everybody was to live on his own land and plant his own food. That's the way it's supposed to be. Every Israelite was given a piece of land for a purpose. When I was growing up in Igbo land, everybody had a farm. So everybody had to bring the food. But when we have left that model, left that standard, naturally we had to adjust. And what we are doing is adjustment. But as Brother Harry said, when we no longer find ourselves in the farm, the Torah made adjustments to it. He said, when you go to that place the Lord your God has chosen, convert that your money to food. But ideally, everybody was to bring food items. That's what I want to contribute to this.
Thank you so much. Then the next question is frequency. How often should one, or the ancient Israelites, or when we look at the Tanakh, how often was tithe given? Was it once a year? Was it every 3 years? Let's discuss that briefly before we move to the next question. Rabbi Rozenberg, I'll start with you.
Sure. First of all, there was a year, you had to do a yearly tithe on your harvest. And they had different cutoff dates for like when the year would stop and start. So for grain and vegetables, it would have been Rosh Hashanah, the new year, which falls around the Gregorian time, September, in the Hebrew calendar. And then you have Tu B'Shvat, which is, we just had, is the 15th of Shvat, which was about a couple of weeks ago, a week or two ago, which would be the cutoff date for fruit. So whatever you harvested from that period of time, that would be the cutoff time where you're like, all right, now I give 10% from this. So that had to have been done on a yearly basis. But there was, I don't know, you sounds like you know about it, but there was something called Meiser Ani. I'm going to put up the source here to see the verse, which was a tithe for the poor. And that we would do in the 3rd and 6th year of a 7-year cycle. There was a 7-year cycle, which is the sabbatical year cycle. And so we're doing a once-a-year tithe. And within that 7-year cycle, the 3rd year and the 6th year, we do a special Meiser for the poor people instead of the Meiser Sheni, instead of the second tithe that we would eat for ourselves in the temple. 2 years we give it to the poor, 2 out of the cycle.
And for most people in the community, they do have questions, because it would appear that there are 3 different types of tithe with different timing. Annual tithe that goes to the Levite. I'm sorry.
And Ani.
So go ahead, Rabbi. We didn't hear you clearly.
I'm interested in hearing the question of the community.
I'm sorry. So let me repeat the question from the community. As it would appear, just reading the text for face value without applying its cultural context, it would appear as if there are 3 different types of tithe. One that goes to the Levite, one that you enjoy as a festival tithe, and then you have the poor tithe.
Right. In Hebrew, Ma'aser Rishon, Ma'aser Sheni, and Ma'aser Ani. So Ma'aser Rishon was, and what we spoke about, after you give what's called in the Torah Truma, the first fruits to the priest. Before you do anything, you do the first fruits to the priests. And then you do the first tithe, which is to the Levites. And then we do the second one, which after you do 10% from whatever you're left with, which is going to be brought from you and your family to the temple. But that one gets swapped out on the 3rd and 6th years with the Meiser Ani for the poor person, the tithe for the poor person. So you don't see going more than 20% in a year, because you're doing 10 and then 10. But there's not, when you do the poor person one, it's instead of the one that you would be doing with the second one for yourself.
Very interesting. Professor Ilona, how do we? Sorry, go ahead, Rabbi.
Oh no, I was saying there's a verse for that if we wanted to look at in Deuteronomy, but I could pull that up if you'd like afterwards.
Sure, thank you so much, Professor Ilona. Same question. What is the frequency of the tithe when it comes to Ominana?
Ihu means to take tithe. It's a yearly affair for the tithe that the family eats together. And the other one that I found frequently in the Igbo community was the one for the Levites. that's every 3 years. You take 10% to the house of that oldest man and that Levite that purifies the land for you. That I said in my own case, my family accommodated some of them. Every 3 years is taken to the OB. The OB is the place we gather, and they come and take it. The one for the poor did not become highly pronounced because I'm not saying we did it exactly the way it should be done, but in pre-modern times, the Igbo would not be comfortable if the poor around him was not well fed. Like my grandmother would leave portions of the food of 3 portions of food on her doorstep every morning. And when I ask who are these for, she will say it's for those who have lost their parents. So probably because the people internalize the notion that nobody should sleep when the poor are hungry. Maybe the one that Harry is mentioning that comes up every 6 years was not streamlined as the other 2 were streamlined.
Thank you so much. Thank you
You
so
know,
much.
we were able to save, or God was able to save, God saved some Igbos from that starvation that was unleashed on the Igbos in Biafra because these traditions were very alive.
Thank you, Professor Ilona. So we'll move to the next question as we consider the upkeep of the place of religious gathering, whether it's the synagogue or the temple. What role did tithe play, if any, in the upkeep of the synagogue or the temple or the meeting place for religious services? Did it play any role? And if not, what was used as a substitute for that?
Well, would you like me to go first?
Yes, you can go first, Rabbi.
Well, if you look at it today in Judaism, right, there is no obligation on the congregation or the congregant to give 10% to the upkeep of the synagogue. That they have to do out of the goodness of their heart. There are families who can't afford it, and there's other families who give 10% for the families in the congregation that can't afford it. So the ones who can't afford it aren't missing out on a commandment by not giving it. It's a nice thing. It's recommended, but we're certainly not obligated according to Torah law to give 10% to our congregation today. And there's nothing religious about it, even if we do it. So it's not part of a prayer ceremony, or it's not part of any requirement in the prayer service of connecting to God. But you will see a guy walk around with a mug, shaking it with some coins in it, going from person to person with, put a few pennies in here, put a few pennies in, put a few dollars, whatever you could do, or go around with a bowl. But that's totally optional and not connected to a Torah law or a requirement by God to be in this congregation. So the rabbi can't invoke God and say, now it's time, according to the scriptures, to give your tithe. He can't do that. He'll be like, show me in the scriptures where I have to do this right now, But he'll say, you know what, guys, I got some electric bills. We're hustling out here. I got a salary to cover. Let's everyone try to contribute.
Thank you so much. Professor Ilona?
Thank you. That question is very important because it's a learning experience for me too, even as I'm contributing. So I love your insights. I love some of the questions you bring up because it takes me back to the past. How we maintain the OB is similar to what Harry explained. My father built one of the older OB that I witnessed when I was growing up. As the most comfortable member of the family then, he built it with his younger brother. They built it out of their own resources. And the more modern OB now was built by my uncle. The tithe was not applied to that. The tithe was expressly kept for what it was legislated to be kept for. The people to eat together and bond together as one people. If the people require resources for running the place they meet, there's a yearly contribution by everybody. Everybody pays that money. Every member, the Igbo family called Umunna. By the way, even through English, it appears that the Israelites understood the family to mean Umunna, that is children of the fathers. Children of the fathers. Everybody pays it every month. I mean, every year, that is used to run, to manage that place the people meet, to make sure it doesn't go into disrepair and so on and so forth. The tithe is never used to run that.
Thank you so much. Any further comments, Rabbi Rozenberg?
No, I agree with Remy's sentiment. I'm using my imagination when he's talking, thinking about like what's going on in Africa with these tribal guys getting together with yams and cocos and sharing and partying. It just sounds all amazing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So let's move the conversation a little bit towards understanding the contemporary context of tithe, which both of you have already shared some insight on what takes place currently. That one, it is not it's not an obligation as far as setting a certain amount when it comes to giving. When we consider the concept of teruma, free will giving, uh, when we look at the temple today, and for most of the people who may not be aware, there is no physical temple in Jerusalem, and there different conversations about constructing a third temple. It's an ongoing conversation, but when we think about the temple concept and where we are today, and we look at different organizations, and this may be a little bit more political than intended, but I think it's important to even discuss. You have religious organizations who claim that they send a tithe to Israel. Is this something that's rooted in rabbinic traditions, or how does that really translate based on the text, Rabbi Rozenberg?
Okay, I mean, it's an interesting concept because the requirement of giving a tithe, we believe, is only Torah commanded in the land of Israel. So you have to have two stipulations. One is you have to be in the land, and two, you have to have the majority of the nation return to the land. And in that case, only in that case, does tithing return to be a Torah-backed obligation. And when it is, it's only in the land. So it wouldn't make sense if someone wants to tithe to say, I want it to go to the land. According to Rabbinic Judaism, descended to the land. That would make a lot of sense to me. Whether or not we're in a period today which the majority of the people of Israel have returned to the land, that, like you said, is an ongoing conversation, which is a debate. If we are in a period where tithing again has become a Torah commandment, or it has not. But obviously, anytime you give anyone any money to give on your behalf, you're going to want total transparency on where that money is going, what the organization's doing with it, whose salary is it financing. Because, I know there are people collecting tithes and they have private jets and they're flying around the world getting tithes, So I don't know how much that has to do with the land of Israel and connecting it. People turned it into a business model, so to say, for themselves. But I think if someone's genuinely collecting for their community and sending to Torah scholars in Israel, Levite Torah scholars, that sounds legitimate and beautiful, since we know, according to Judaism, tithing is a requirement to be in the land. So when we were in Europe or in Spain or Morocco or Iraq and Babylon, wasn't a Torah-backed commandment for us at the time.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rozenberg. Professor Ilona, what are your thoughts on that? How is it carried out in Igbo culture?
We do not collect tithes to send anywhere out, as I said. We simply, the Ihu comes to the community and is used to keep the community together, used to foster brotherly feelings. And so we do not really have much to say about that, because it doesn't apply to us.
That definitely makes sense. That definitely makes
And
sense.
somewhere along the line, a free
I'm sorry, if you could repeat that for us, Professor Ilona. I think we lost you for the last few seconds.
Okay, yeah, I was talking about the free will offering. That was what my father did by him and his younger brother coming together to set a good obi for the family. And that was what his younger brother did again a few years ago by setting up a more edifying one, a larger one, since the family has grown in numbers. But as for collecting money from anybody to send to anywhere, no, we don't do that.
Okay.
We
I'll
apply,
follow up.
we use our tithes to maintain to keep our communities together.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Now, this question may be a bit controversial. It may be a bit controversial. So I just kind of want to warn you ahead of time. When we think about tithe and the biblical, historical, and contemporary context of tithe, were non-Israelites required to tithe?
I don't think they were required to, but they weren't prevented from it.
Okay.
I could try to find the source for you now, but I was actually just learning the other day that it's possible you could have a partnership on a farm with a non-Jew or non-Israelite in the land, and on your field, he's not obligated to give 10th, and you are. So how do you calculate it when you have a partnership on the land? And the Talmud goes into a whole long discussion on how to deal with that, which you're able to. It's the fact that you're able to do it, I think, teaches us that the non-Israelite was not obligated.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Professor Ilona? Are those who are, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's very clear to us that non-Israelites shouldn't do it because as we see Omenana, it's strictly an Igbo affair. Strictly an Igbo or somebody who becomes a member of the Igbo community. And we know that somebody can become an Igbo community, though it's extremely rare for that to happen because we apply the standards you find in the Torah that grandchild that will be an Israelite. So it's very clear to us that it's not for people who are not members of our communities because they don't do Omenana with us. So why would they bring their tithes to the Obi when they wouldn't come to the Obi? They wouldn't.
Thank you so much, Professor Ilona. And again, another controversial question. Go ahead.
Add one more thing over there. So I found the source. We have this is one of the many sources, but we have a Mishnah, which was written by Rabbi Judah the Prince 2,000 years ago in Israel. In the Mishnah Remote, chapter 3, part 9, parak, third parak, it says Teruma given by a non-Jew or a Samaritan is Truma, and their tithes are tithes, and their dedications to the temple are dedications. Which we learn from that is that they're not obligated to do it because they're coming to teach us that they still get to do it. It's still called a tithe if they do it. So I would think that it wouldn't be called it. So the Mishnah comes and teaches us, no, it's still called tithe, even though they're not obligated to do it. And then here comes Maimonides 1,000 years later and writes a commentary, and he says that a non-Israelite or a Gentile that wants to perform a commandment like this, he's not obligated to, but he's certainly allowed to and may even be rewarded for doing such a thing in life. But I think the situation with Igbo land, with Remy, is we're dealing with different geographical situations because the time of the temple, you had people from all around the world coming to this massive one location for a festival. So it was much more common you're going to deal with Gentiles there. But in Igbo land, it seems that since there's not one temple, they're doing it at their own locations and their own lots. it's much more of like a you got to be in the know to get invited to the thing type of thing. So it's not like an open house party where people could just roll through like the Holy Temple was. So I think that's a practical difference between the times of the temple and what's going on in Igbo land. But certainly they weren't prevented from giving, but they weren't required by Torah law.
Thank you so much. So what I'm hearing, we have the biblical text, and then we have, of course, traditions that take us deeper or give us insight that most of these practices that we see today, that it's really communal affair, if I can say that, and the community is doing what they do based on how they choose to walk out Torah. It's not binding, it's not an obligation, and how we continue in the diaspora, because one of the reasons why we're having this discussion, because we have Israelites throughout the diaspora. Most are reconnecting with their Hebraic or their Israelite heritage and roots, and we were taught the concept of tithe through the Christian lens. And now that we're coming to understand who we are as a people, we want to ensure that we're walking our Torah based on the principles that were laid out by the Most High of Israel. So thank you, gentlemen. I will ask one more question and then we'll wrap up. This has been a very fruitful discussion. And the last question that I have concerning tithe, when we look at the scriptures and we look at the historical concept, we look at the contemporary concept, what position are we in to state clearly that those who are teaching tithe outside of the biblical text, what position does that put them in? And I'll be a little bit more clear and a little bit more concise. Those who are teaching tithe, and for example, they're Gentiles and they're receiving tithes, are they doing so illegally?
I would say if a pastor is in a church and says, now you got to fulfill your God-given duty to give me your tithe because I'm your priest, I would say the guy's stretch. That's a stretch. It's a long stretch. Listen, he could take the 10%. People can give the 10%, but he can't invoke saying fulfilling a Torah obligation to give it to me. He can't put that on someone's shoulder. He could take it. They can give it. And that's encouraged, by the way. But he can't use the Torah as the threatening mechanism to say, this is why you have to do it.
Professor Ilona, what are your thoughts on that?
I may say something that may be controversial, but I think it's for the greater good, so I would say it. We would, and I think we will do what I'm going to suggest now, and I thank people like you and I thank people like Harry that open themselves up for dialogue. Referring expressly to what Harry said, if somebody like a pastor in a church takes tithe and does something else with it, he can't find Torah backing for it. But does it happen? It happens because there is a need to go back to that Torah. I've had cause to tell some friends of mine from the rabbinic community who would say, when Jews came out of Egypt, and I tell them, no, stop rewriting the Torah. Say, when Israelites came out of Egypt. When you say when Jews come out of Egypt, you are already rewriting the Torah. So when somebody also begins to take a Torah practice and misapply it, the person is only stretching what you started. So there is an incentive for us to go back to the Torah, and I explored it here. And people that have read it, this book I'm showing you, agree that there is every reason for us to try to go back to what we find in the Torah and do that. These modern ideas, they have served their purposes. They have served their purposes, whatever fate befell us after we were thrown out of the land of Israel befell us because we lacked information. We did not fully understand what God was telling us. The Torah itself was very few then, only few of the copies were available. Now, in the hand of everybody that descended from the Israelites, there are written Bibles. We should read these things and go back to that Torah. And if we are finding it difficult to understand what the Torah is saying in some cases, we have an unbroken tradition, omenana. An unbroken tradition that can tell us exactly this is how it's done, this is how it's done, this is how it's done. And my brothers, we are one family. We are one family. If omenana preserved a lot of things, it preserved it for the whole of Israel, not only for the Igbos. I yield back, as you say in your Congress.
Thank you so much, Professor Ilona. At this time, I'll give each guest an opportunity to give their final thoughts on this subject matter of tithe, as we've looked at the biblical, historical, and contemporary context of tithe, as we've done an overview. Rabbi Rozenberg, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for meeting us here to discuss this and sharing some insights. Definitely, there's some things that you share that's very fascinating, especially in the land of Israel with the supermarkets and how they look at certain things, produce, and ask if tithe has already been taken on it. And I'd love to probably have a sidebar with you on that, because that is very interesting. It's the first time I'm hearing that. So I'll give you an opportunity to share a little bit more on that if you so choose, and then share your closing remarks.
Sure. I mean, there's levels, you'll laugh, but there's levels to the game, because if a supermarket is actually taking their tithes, right, or fruit store, and they'll put up a sign, it's not enough for them to put up a sign. They have to hire a rabbinic organization to validate and verify that they're actually doing it. So they're having a third-party inspector come to see them do it and sign off on it, and then to put someone else's signature on the store. So it's not like the store owner is letting you know, because we don't even trust the store owner. We need to hear from an independent third agency that has no vested interests in this store that this was actually done. And then once you do that, there's different certifying organizations where some people will even say, you know what, they're not strict enough for me. So I see that you got this sign on your store, but I don't even follow that recommendation. I'm a stricter. You know, so there's levels to the game of how strict people are with keeping their commandments. So there's different organizations that have different levels of strictness, you know. But at the end of the day, God doesn't want that to be reason for us to be separated from each other. It shouldn't be cause for lack of unionship, because you have this custom or I have this custom. That's between you and God, what type of vegetable you do or don't want to eat. But don't let that enter the sphere of human dialogue and human decency and having unconditional love for your brother Israelite, no matter who, what, where, why he is in the world. So I'll just throw that out there. If you want, when I go shopping on Friday afternoon before Shabbat, you could FaceTime me and I'll show you the market, and I'll show you all the different booths with the different certificates on the walls.
Wow.
I'd be happy to do that. And to end off on the last note, you know, I was always told, like, you know, it's so cliche when you know, this is controversial, obviously, but when the white man dangles money in front of the African or people from Africa, like, we always try to like trick them or entice them with money. But I do hope at the bottom of my heart there's a day where the tithing of the Jewish people, because there's an amazing amount of wealth amongst the Jewish people, will help go towards building back up the African Torah connection that once flourished, and helping them connect to it. So if anything I could do in my position to act as a highway in the world of tithing, to bring needed resources to villages for electricity production, greenhouses, and all these things to rebuild the communities, I would love to help that, because I think that the Jewish people today are tithing, they're giving to organizations, but we're not seeing such a big effect, you know? So a family will give $1 million something to an organization, and they'll call it a success if they inspired 20 people to change their lives. And I'm like, 20 people? And you put a few $1 million into this project? I said, come on, guys, we got to tithe better. So in that regard, I'd like to be at the table when we have the African Jewish Alliance, strengthening, and how we're going to allocate funds for charity and resources. It's going to be a big dream of mine to help be at that table and make sure things are transparent, where the money's going, who's getting it, what projects is it going for, and how does it show for itself. And so let's make the world of tithing transparent. Whether maybe we should start doing it on the blockchain with Bitcoin so we can see where it's going, who's having it. But we can save that for a 2.0 conversation on the matter.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rozenberg. It was a delight to have you. Professor Ilona?
I think I have said everything I would say on Tithe, so I'll use my slots, my own opportunity to thank you for organizing this talk and to encourage you to tell you to organize more discussions like this. And I will also thank Harry for coming on board and tell him to find like-minded people in his own community, the Jewish community. I will also find like-minded Igbos. Let these interactions continue so that ultimately we will become one community again and members of your own community involved so that we would all head back to the Torah and become one people again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And what we've heard here today, we've heard two different communities represented with different perspectives. And as I shared, this is not to hammer out doctrine. This is just to understand the customs of communities as they understand the biblical, historical, and contemporary context of tithe. We did understand that some things are not an obligation based on the community, and some things are rabbinic traditions. It's not rooted in Torah. It's strictly a rabbinic tradition and how they halakha or walk out Torah. And we will continue to explore some of these topics as we look at different customs and different practices to better understand the broader picture of Israelite culture as we rediscover our roots and our heritage as Israelites. So again, thank you to Rabbi Rozenberg, and thank you so much to Professor Ilona. We ask that you continue to support their work in the community. Professor Ilona has written several books and continues to share the Igbo culture and its Hebraic tradition. And Professor Rabbi Rozenberg has made it known that he would like to be a bridge to bring together the community in general so that the Jewish community can support the Afro-Hebraic community. And I'm sorry, some of these terms may seem a little vague, but for the purpose of this conversation, we want to ensure that we acknowledge the broader communities that are out in the diaspora, whether they're Jewish or African. Hallelujah. So we thank you so much for spending time with us. And I hope that something that we shared on this broadcast have inspired you to even dig a little bit deeper and to bring some clarity to our understanding of tithe. In all our getting, we seek to get an understanding. So again, thank you so much. And we say shalom to our YouTube audience. Until next time, shalom, shalom.
Shalom.